Hello, here is my lecture on posthumanism, and it is structured into three parts. So here's the outline. We'll begin by thinking about humanism, which is one way of thinking about what it means to be human. Then we'll think about posthumanism, which is another way of thinking about what it means to be human. And then we'll finish by thinking about the relationship between posthumanism and disability. So, humanism is one way of thinking about what it means to be human. It has its roots in ancient Greece and came to prominence during the Italian Renaissance. That's the rebirth of culture after the medieval period, and then on into the Enlightenment period, which takes us from the Renaissance through up till about the Industrial Revolution. So Da Vinci's image of the Vitruvian man, which represents the classical ideal of man, was made in 1492. So that's the kind of period that we're talking about here. Now, Da Vinci's Vitruvian man image is a very good way of summarizing this classical ideal of man. Um, so, firstly, we have the idea of man as the measure of all things. So, a kind of the pinnacle of God's creation and the sort of master of nature. Um, so, man as the measure of all things. And Da Vinci's drawing of Vitruvian man also points to those notions of bodily perfection and perfectibility. Um, so the idea that the human body was both the pinnacle of God's creation and kind of endlessly perfectible, which is an idea that we still have now, I think, come from this humanist way of thinking about humans. So we have ideas around the body and we also have ideas around the mind. So in the humanist ideal, people are seen as rational, and so that's logical in their thinking, as being self-regulating and intrinsically moral. So the idea that people will tend to, do the right thing. So there are cognitive and also, if you like, moral or spiritual dimensions of this humanist way of thinking about people, which are summed up in this phrase mens sana in corpore sano, which is a healthy mind in a healthy body, right? A phrase that you've probably heard before. So, but these ideals of bodily perfection and being rational, capable, responsible, competent entities all stem from this humanist way of thinking about people. And this philosophy is underpinned by a faith in science and reason as ways of the human race making progress, and later on also to ideas of capitalism as another way of ensuring human progress. So the ideals epitomized so the ideas espoused by humanism are epitomised in Da Vinci's drawing of Vitruvian man. So he is male, he is white, he is perfectly proportioned, he's kind of athletic and fit looking, he's symmetrical. So all those bodily ideals are represented in the image. And also he's alone, he's bounded, right? He's isolated within his box and within his sphere. So this idea of humans being separate, self-contained entities, um, kind of isolated from one another, is another aspect of humanism. And these ideals are not only ways of thinking about individual people, but they also are influential in how we think about culture, right? What a culture should be like. So the ideals of humanism are linked to cultural imperialism. The idea that there's a them and an us, and so it's a very Eurocentric, a very European way of thinking about people, and help give support to movements around, for instance, colonialism and empire building, right, which would make the foreign them more like us, right? So it's a particular set of ideals rooted in European culture, with man, or the stereotypical man, as the measure of all things. Now, in contrast to that, we have a more recent way of thinking about humans, which we call posthumanism. So, a way of thinking about humans that comes after humanism. And the basis for this um, is explained by Rosie Braidotti in her book called The Posthuman. So, she says right on the very first page, the concept of the human has exploded under the double pressure of contemporary scientific advances and global economic concerns. So, the post-human or post-humanism, it represents a paradigm shift, a fundamental and a major shift in thinking about both the nature of the human species and about our individual identities, and that's what we'll go on to explore through the rest of the lecture. So, in other words, advances in things like biotechnology and medicine and medical technology, as well as kind of late stage neoliberal capitalism, have really pushed that traditional idea, the humanist idea of the human, to its breaking point. And so the argument is we need a new way to think about what it means to be human. And at its heart, actually, posthumanism is an optimistic way of thinking about humans, and an optimistic way of thinking about the future. So, rather than seeing current trends as a sort of moment of crisis, which is, I think, a tendency that a lot of us perhaps have, given concerns around the environment, for instance, global warming, rather than seeing these as moments of crisis or tragedy, posthumanism offers alternative and affirmative ways of thinking about what it means to be human. And under those models, those people who were previously seen as othered and seen as disposable under humanism are brought to the centre. So women, right, racial minorities, and so on. And we recognise the multiple and intersecting identities of people. So that is represented on the cover of Rosie Braidotti's book, where rather than a man being at the centre of the image, it's a woman, um, and it's a kind of very techno version, if you like, of Vitruvian Man, because we can see a kind of circuit board outside the figure of the in the picture, which again speaks to technology. She's got this sort of bright light shining out of her chest, which also indicates, I think, this brighter technological future. And we can also see spirals of DNA, which again speak to ideas around identity, as well as science and medicine and those kinds of ideals. So posthumanism represents these alternative affirmative models for what it means to be human, recognizing those intersecting identities of people, and also, given the concerns of our times, also recognizing our interconnectedness and interdependence with other people, and beyond that, to recognize our interconnectedness and interdependence with other species, and with ecology more generally. So Rosie Braidotti talks about this idea of a nature culture continuum. So rather than us having man as being the pinnacle of nature, and sort of in command of God's beasts, in that old sort of biblical view, rather than us being at the pinnacle of or slightly separate from nature, we are seeing, we imagine ourselves as, or we recognize ourselves as part of nature, and living in interdependence with it. So this is easy to think about. If we think about the way that we have recently come to realize, for instance, the importance of bees, right? And the fact that human beings simply won't survive as a species if we allow bees to die out. We are dependent on bees. So at one end of the continuum, we recognise that interdependence. On the other end of the continuum, perhaps we recognise the very amazing possibilities for a high tech future, and some of that we'll go on to explore now. So, as it says here, one of the major concerns of posthumanism is around technology. And as Dan Goodley says, the blurring of technology, biology, and society is an especially post-human concern. And Donna Haraway, in a very, very influential essay called The Cyborg Manifesto, asked this very pertinent question: why should our bodies stop at the skin? So it's quite easy nowadays to make the case that our bodies don't, in fact, stop at the skin. So if you just stop and think for a moment about your own use of your mobile phone and how often you hold that in your hand, how often you touch it, how often you look at it, how often you feel it and play with it. So our mobile phones are very much now extensions of our bodies because we rarely, many of us, let them go. So that we can say that our bodies perhaps don't stop at the skin, but extend into and onto our mobile phones, and not just our bodies, but our minds as well. So our mobile phones are, and there's lots of evidence about this, are changing the way that we think. So, for instance, there's fairly good evidence that for a lot of people, rather than remembering stuff, they are remembering where to find stuff using their phone. So, where to find things on the internet or using Google. It's a different way of thinking. A different kind of cognition, a different kind of memory. But many of us are outsourcing much of our thinking and much of our remembering to our mobile phones, right? So our bodies and even our minds, we could say, don't stop at the skin anymore because we have become so dependent on these mobile phone prosthetics. So mobile phones are one sort of prosthetic or one sort of technology, which is of concern to posthumanism. Others are technologies around robotics, neuroscience, and genetics. And we touched on several of these, I'm sure you'll remember, when we looked at technology just before Christmas. But we're going to explore this idea of technology and relationships between technologies and people a little bit more now, with a particular focus on cyborgs and oracles. And I've taken this title from a blog post that just came out a day or two ago by Alice Wong, whose work you may have come across before. So when we use that word cyborg, we often perhaps dream up or come to mind these very sort of high-tech, sleek, sexy kind of sci-fi visions. But in fact, it's probably the case that many disabled people are cyborgs already because of their very close relationship, their interdependence with technology. So when we're talking about a cyborg, what we mean is a hybrid of machine and organism. And Alice Wong calls herself a cyborg because she is so dependent on technology to the point where it is part of her body. So not only her wheelchair, her power chair, but the equipment that she uses for breathing. So she says, I use a non-invasive form of ventilation called a BiPAP. My vent is part of my body. I cannot be without it for an hour at the most. I am so dependent on my ventilator that it is attached to my wheelchair where it draws continuous power from my chair's battery. It is part of my cyborg being. So there's the relationship with technology, which is, the one part of being post-human. And then we come on to the bit which is about interdependence. I find strength and hope from communities organising mutual aid and providing care for one another. And of course, the context of this blog post, which, as I say, just came out a couple of days ago, is the spread of coronavirus, which is showing us, all of us, just how interdependent and interconnected we all are, as a global community. So, and the fact that many disabled people have often had to self-isolate for one reason or another, the fact that they recognise their interdependence on or with other human beings and have done so for many years is why Alice Wong calls disabled people the oracles, right? The vision of the future that everybody ought to be attending to. So we have that cliche, if you like, that if you're not already disabled, you are TAB, right? TAB, temporarily able-bodied. We all become disabled if we live long enough. And because of concerns around coronavirus, around climate change, the threat of a third world war, right? All of these, because of the potential for all of these things, Alice Wong and other disabled people are saying the world needs to pay more attention to us because more and more of the world is going to become more and more like us as these trends develop. Now, that might sound, I know, a bit doom and gloom, but remember that post-humanism is essentially an optimistic way of thinking about people. So it's a way and about the future. So it's, if you like, a way of or a basis for getting our way out of the mess that we've got ourselves into with neoliberalism, hyper-individualism, competition, capitalism, trashing the environment, and so on. So the idea here is that if we adopt a post-human philosophy, we focus less about ourselves as individuals and realize that our strengths and our potential lies in our relationships with each other, and that it does not reside simply in atomized individuals. So we see our capacity, we see our resources, we see our potential as residing in our relationships, in our interconnectedness, in our interdependence, and not as being independent and autonomous. Now, we've explored ideas around ableism and neoliberalism elsewhere on the course. And we've had that idea from Doug Goodley that ableism is an ideal that nobody lives up to. So if we adopt a post-human perspective, what we can do then is accept that is an ideal that nobody can live up to, and then rather than pathologize or demonize, if you like, people who don't live up to that ideal, because after all nobody does, we accept our ability to match the neoliberal imperative, and we find other ways of being which are more inclusive, collectively based, and so on. So we embrace and thrive on that which we fear. So in other words, people tend to fear disability. They tend to fear becoming disabled. But rather than living in that, um, rather than living in fear, the idea here is that we embrace our disabled future, because it looks as though, as people live longer, as things like coronavirus and perhaps climate change happen, the disabled body will become the rule and not the exception. And therefore, we have to break out of our old ways of thinking and learn to appreciate and value other kinds of embodiment. So we resist, right? We throw off that neoliberal imperative and instead figure out and celebrate other ways of being and working. Now, that is summarized again on another version of the Vitruvian Man, which is printed on the cover of Mitchell and Snyder's book, The Biopolitics of Disability. And the image here is called a Vitruvian Man with CP, that's CP for cerebral palsy. And the idea was to subvert that traditional image or the classic image of Vitruvian Man by presenting, if you like, a crip, right, or a disabled version of that. So rather than being tightly constrained by the circle and the square, as the original Vitruvian Man was, this figure reaches out of, breaks out of that very confined space, and the arrangement of his limbs is there to denote forms of muscular atrophy and the kind of spasticity that comes with cerebral palsy. And he's very much not standing, in the classical Vitruvian way. So his legs akimbo. He's what they call decidedly neuroatypical in posture. So it's there as an antithesis of what they call the bounded perfection of Vitruvian Man. So the idea is that we now need to think about humans in this more inclusive and wide-ranging way. Now, Dan Goodley goes on to talk about how we might come to desire disability because of the possibility that it opens up for us. So he talks about our desires around education, and particularly inclusive education, about our desires around love and life and pleasure being moved from being fixed in notions of lack to being fluid assemblages in connection with each other. And similarly, Rosa Braidotti lays out her dream for where posthumanism could take us. And I'll just finish by quoting that. I belong to a generation that had a dream. It was and still is the dream of actually constituting communities of learning. Schools, universities, books and curricula, debating societies, theatre, radio, television and media programmes, and later websites and computer environments that look like the society they both reflect, serve and help to construct. It is the dream of producing socially relevant knowledge that is attuned to basic principles of social justice, the respect for human decency and diversity, the rejection of false universalisms, the affirmation of the positivity of difference, the principles of academic freedom, anti-racism, open to others, and conviviality. And that is the possibility that posthumanism offers. Okay, if you want to know more, these are the sources I have drawn in devising this lecture. I hope that was useful. That's all. The end.